Astreas, a land of shadow and dust, where glorious kingdoms have fallen, and cursed monsters shamble in ruins across the land. What little of the old dynasties remain are just dim points of light in a vast wasteland. Now, the greatest champions of the age strike out to right the wrongs of Astreas, maybe not out of the goodness of their hearts, but out of a desire for vengeance, and to see freedom return to all who have lost it. How did this come to pass? In this video, instead of diving too deep into the lore of Astreas, which we want to save for the actual book, I wanted to talk about everything that inspired us to make this adventure, where it came from, and what you can take from it as an adventurer or as a dungeon master. I've described Astreas as a sword and sorcery campaign, or a pulp fantasy campaign. Its very name is an homage to H.P. Lovecraft's The Doom That Came to Sarnath, and there are a lot of similarities between the two. But what exactly is sword and sorcery anyway? Essays could be written about this topic, but to keep it short, it's a type of fantasy often derived from Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian, H.P. Lovecraft's weird fiction, and expanded upon by Fritz Leiber, Michael Moorcock, and other authors during the 20th century. Compared with, say, The Lord of the Rings, sword and sorcery isn't necessarily more down-to-earth, but it's certainly more savage and swashbuckling, with larger-than-life heroes carving names for themselves in exotic, dangerous places where magic and supernatural monsters are nightmarish and strange, although there are no hard and fast rules for the genre. If anything, sword and sorcery is both an aesthetic flavor and a philosophy. The philosophy being a disdain for civilization, which is shown as decadent and crumbling, or even completely fallen, opening the door for heroes and villains alike to carve their own destinies, without the burden of medieval ideals like God, king, and country. Many sword and sorcery adventures take place in exotic and distant Bronze Age or even Stone Age settings, Greek or Roman at best. My co-author and I grew up in the 80s, and back then, sword and sorcery took off like a rocket thanks to the popularity of the Conan the Barbarian movie, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. People started to forget about the old pulp serials from the 1930s, and they started to associate the whole genre with barbarian movies like Beastmaster and Ator, until eventually the whole thing burned out a few years later. Dungeons and Dragons started to die with it coincidentally. But my first taste of sword and sorcery didn't come from a movie or book. It actually came from video games, the time-honored pastime for any 80s kid. The first arcade game I remember playing was actually Altered Beast. Even though I was only 6 at the time, I knew it was something different, and that game, and others like Golden Axe, left an indelible impression on me, with their weird Greco-Roman inspired settings, bizarre magic, and creepy enemies. In our setting, our cursed bestial races are in part inspired by Altered Beast, and the idea of a Bronze Age warrior taking the form of a monstrous hero. Another game that really left an impression on us was Zelda II: The Adventure of Link on the NES. Even now, its columned palaces, animal-headed monsters, and eerie atmosphere helped inspire the doom that came to Astreas. Some of the later villages in the game were completely empty, inhabited only by ghosts, as some dreaded evil crept across the land. The same is true of Astreas. The boss of the first palace, the gigantic horse-headed warrior, persists in the setting as a major villain. Zelda II was also a low-magic adventure. Magic was simplistic, not like D&D. Sometimes your spells didn't help you much at all, especially not against some of the game's overpowering challenges. Video games were our youth, but we would both get into the movies later, of course, and to this day, Conan the Barbarian is probably my favorite fantasy movie of all time, and the sequel, Conan the Destroyer, is almost blatantly based on Dungeons and Dragons, to the point where it's nearly a parody of itself. We both love it though. The villain, Queen Tamris, in that movie was the direct basis for our Sorceress Queen, the ultimate evil of Astreas. But we were also inspired by a few other sources, like Bavmorda from Willow, and her brazen magic, horrifically turning all of the soldiers into pigs. How terrifying. We even have a bit of Star Wars in Astreas, like the Mos Eisley Cantina, and especially the idea that not everyone in your party is expected to be completely human. You'll have to forgive us, but we were also influenced a little by Rita Repulsa from Power Rangers and her right-hand monster Goldar. All of this goes to show that Sword and Sorcery was never completely about being deadly serious. It had moments of cheesiness and lighthearted humor even back in the Robert E. Howard days. That's part of the genre's appeal, and why it endures. It can be schlocky, over-the-top adventure, or it can be heart-skipping eldritch horror. One of our longest-lasting characters was a barbarian named Blondar, which one of our friends rolled up during an early AD&D session many years ago. At the time, we just rolled 1d20 down the line for our ability scores, and Blondar rolled Strength 20, Intelligence 2. He was the most stereotypical barbarian imaginable, a hilarious compilation of every barbarian movie we could think of. He had an 80s perm like the American Gladiator Malibu, and we imagined a whole movie where he went back in time to the 80s, like in Beastmaster 2. Blondar was our comic relief, but we eventually started to take him a little more seriously, even to the point of giving him a more reasonable name. Today, Blondar is one of the main characters in the Doom that came to Astreas. He's the barbarian king Kyrodar, who regained his youth after traveling back in time to challenge the Sorcerer's Queen and free his people. You can play as him, or use him and his brother Pinnigan, another early AD&D character of ours, as critical NPCs. Don't let this fool you into thinking that the Doom that came to Astreas is going to be too silly. Yes, it's true, we still wear our Robert E. Howard influences on our sleeves, just not too tightly. It is a pre-written campaign, so it does have a beginning, middle, and end, and a terrible villain to be defeated. Even Conan the Barbarian faced sorcerers and warlords who threatened the entirety of his domain. But you can explore the entire world of Astreas, or go straight for the prize. Personal glory and riches, or pure heroism, it's up to you. Just like the Chronicles of Aeres, our fantasy flashbacks are far too vast to let a single book or movie dominate the whole setting. Astreas, like all of our other books, will always resonate with your nostalgia and your favorite memories of both heroic fantasy and sword and sorcery. Even if you just mine the setting for fresh ideas for your own campaign, we're sure it'll have plenty of action and adventure to offer. Check out our Kickstarter below. We need your help to get the funding necessary to deliver an awesome hardcover copy of The Doom That Came to Astreas. If you're watching this after the Kickstarter is over, the adventure should already be available for an affordable price on DriveThruRPG, along with our other D&D books, which have an old school high fantasy style. Again, thanks for all of your support.